Hello, welcome to Bounce Back Generation. This is our podcast. We explore resilience, what makes us strong to handle life, and what saps our strength. Today, we're going to talk about violence. Is America a violent place? Let's explore that. Are we thinking that we can't walk out the front door without something terrible happening? Are there immigrants around that are out there doing violent crimes? Well, yes, okay, but let's look at the data a little bit. Immigrants are actually less inclined to be violent than homegrown Americans. But then there's the other end of the spectrum where people might say, we have to think about the individual. What about their childhood? What brought them to this spot where they are now committing a violent crime? We talk about that in terms of school shooters. There's a space in between where both of those things make sense to look at. So my guest is Amanda Brown, and she is the founder of AB Livewell. She combines her background in community advocacy, strategic planning, and professional coaching, and she really wants to make a difference in reducing violent crimes. She has a master's degree in peace and justice from the University of San Diego, and she's committed to reducing community violence, to youth development, and anti-human trafficking. And she is someone who is looking at not only the data, but also what is happening on the ground and how can she be facilitating conversations between, for example, a gang member and the police department. And all with the opportunity to not only understand violence and where it comes from, but what are the little things and the big things we can do to make this country, make your neighborhood a safer place to be. You're going to learn about this and you're going to learn about what you can do as an individual. But first, let me give you three terms that are used in this, violence reduction world, some of the lingo. First is credible messenger. Very simply, a credible messenger is someone who's been through the system and comes out and then acts as a mentor to young people so that they don't follow in their footsteps. Second is restorative justice. Restorative justice, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but basically what you're trying to do is repair the harm that happened from that violent crime. And that can mean maybe the perpetrator meeting with the victim, or it can mean there's lots of different ways of doing it. But basically what you want to do is allow for some healing to happen. And this can be very effective if you want to prevent retaliation, for example, like gang on gang, that sort of thing. Finally, trauma-informed. Trauma-informed means that if somebody has been traumatized, you just do actions to help not re-traumatize them. So the way you might ask a question of a victim, for example, if you're a police officer, or the way that you understand where someone is in their healing process. All right, let's get started. Thanks for being here. Amanda Brown, you are here with us. I'm going to do a whole intro and all of that, so we don't have to worry about that. So let's just go ahead and jump into the questions. And right. I want to start out, what's your perspective on the way in which we look at violence and the way in which we kind of from your perspective, how are you looking at the world differently than someone who does not think about violence might be kind of going about their day?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I think earlier in my field, I just was super, even before I got into this field, very naive, right? I grew up in a very white town in Connecticut, which was a beautiful place to grow up. But whenever I thought of violence, it was kind of that reactionary, oh yeah, everybody should be locked up. If you're on the streets, if you're causing violence, that equates to punishment, that equates to just not being around those individuals. So I say that because since I've gotten in the field, my perspective has shifted a 180 perspective. What I'm seeing is just in the field in general, it's still the reactionary, even though it's more restorative policies. Okay, we're looking at not just locking people up, but how can we restore a human being, hold them accountable to some level. And then the restoration comes and, then they're maybe giving back with their own mentoring or starting their own nonprofits and living a successful, non-detrimental life. I think that's a portion of it.
Yeah.
Right. That's a portion of the work. But what about the longer term impacts of the generational trauma with oppression, racism, that we don't really want to talk about sometimes, in these spaces? I'm not talking about in these conversations, but in the spaces with government, with the DA's office, public defenders, even though people may be more restorative now, I think sometimes we fail to look at what's the impact on violence then, even of that person who's a credible messenger now, who's restored their life and is working towards a positive change. We still need to take those things in consideration. So that's really where I like to come in and say, okay, well, how are we going to effectively build trust? If something happened, let's talk about it so we can actually move forward. So it's almost like, think of it as like a back and forth pull between the past, the present, and the future, where we've got to sometimes go backward, see what's happened, and then how that is impacting right now present violence, and how can it impact the future. And it takes a lot of courage. I mean, it's where I'm building and going towards. I even sometimes have to take a step back and, because I'm putting myself out there and having these conversations that are not easy to have. I just had a situation this week between the police department and one of our members on the ground, and they were not seeing eye to eye. So I'm just like in the middle and like have to really listen through all the opinions and the noise out there. So
I wish we had a chart to show people that, if you look at violence, you can't look at, like you're saying, you can't just look at that incident and then say, where
right,
do we go from this incident or this person in this moment in time?
right,
You do have to go back to childhood. And what we talk about at Bounce Back Generation too is you have to go back to your evolutionary human development, which which left all of us with a very well developed fear center. So we react to things, and that's how we survived. That's how we survived over
yeah,
eons of time, is having very good fear centers that say, I'm not going to let this thing or person or whatever get over on me. But then there's also
yeah,
genetics. There's adversity in childhood, adverse childhood experiences that can influence how our brains develop. So
hmm,
there's a whole timeline of things that happen. And then when you get to the point where, like you said, you're maybe talking to the police are saying, look, I'm not in charge of the childhood part of this. I can
right,
only deal
right,
with what is in front of me, and I have a job to do. And I think that's part of what perhaps you're working on, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, is how do you bring all of those different elements together, the childcare portion, the understanding of our brain development portion, the understanding of how how reacts people respond to fear in different ways, all of
yep.
that. So let's kind of reel back and talk about what it is you do, and how you try to fit those pieces together.
What I actually get paid for is to collect everyone's activity, like sift through it. What are we going to actually put in this report that then goes out to the city and the police departments and everything? That is kind of like the on paperness of it. And then there's just a whole other subset of being an advocate when situations show up. I don't just focus on that little subset. It's like I just bring my whole holistic experience to it. So that's what I've been doing. And then in the past year or so, I've been getting more into working with cities on like an ecosystems approach. So I've never been in the gang, formerly incarcerated. So I don't know what it's like to walk that life. So the credible messenger, hence the term credible, is that mentor for that youth or that adult that can say, hey, I've walked your life, I've lived it, I know what it's like to be in the trenches, and now I know what it's like to restore my life and be out of it, right?
Yeah.
That credible messenger literally going out on the streets, talking to a gangster on the street, just like going up to him and saying, hey, like what's happening? And
Yeah.
that's like the heart of it for me, is like so inspiring, because like I said, I get to read all of the activity from these guys every single month. I just did it yesterday, and it's just like the stories of them going up to this someone they don't even know on the street and putting their life out there because they've been through it and can talk to them. And it's not a police officer, it's not academia. That's like where I believe some of the juice of the work is.
You know, as you know, Bounce Back Generation, that we do a lot of stuff that's online. And one of the things that
Yeah.
we have done is gone into Sunnydale, which is the largest public housing site in San
Oh, cool.
Francisco. And
Yeah.
and I used to work there years ago, so I know a lot of folks there. Know a lot of kids who are now adults that have grown up there.
Yeah.
So we went in and filmed, and we talked to some of the the OGs, the old the old guys.
Yeah,
And
the OGs. Yep.
I don't want to use the other term because it may be
It's okay.
derogatory for some, but the old guys. And what they did is they just went on camera and they just talked about their experiences. And one of them is a dear friend, Larry, who actually had lost part of his leg because he was in an escape from the police. He got injured,
Mm,
and he's just a brilliant, super interesting, smart, great, credible messenger. And then
yeah.
he gathered a group around, and they just talked about their feelings. You know what it feels like to grow up the way that they did, and to find themselves stuck in this life that of crime and violence, and there's really, what's your alternative, working McDonald's or
Yeah.
whatever. And some of them had,
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
yeah, and then
Yeah. That's exactly. You just, yeah.
some of them were formerly incarcerated, so they talked about what it was like to come out, and try to rebuild their lives. So anyway, my point
Yeah.
is that having that video, it's really popular on our YouTube channel. It gets watched over and over again. And I
Mm,
think what I find working with the young people, and we also worked in Potrero Hill, Terraces and Annex, which is another public housing site, is that there is a just you scratch the surface and there's so much emotion there. These guys are just brimming with a need to express their
yeah.
sadness, their
Mhm.
fears, their traumas that they went
Mhm.
through, and they
Mhm.
can't because they have been, I mean, you can't show weakness at all. You can't cry, you can, so you get high, you go do what you got to do, and then you don't
Yeah.
feel, and the only time you
Yep.
can feel is when someone dies. And
Yeah.
so then it's, a ceremony, it's an opportunity to release some of that, but it's tragic. It's anyway,
Mhm.
so I
Yeah.
hear what you're saying, and I think that there are a lot of people who wish that they could be a credible messenger, but they don't know where
Yeah.
to go and how to start doing that.
I think there's a couple of different things, right? And it takes courage, right? It could be as simple, which is simple, not simple, like looking up, like, where are the nonprofits in the specific city or area that are doing credible messenger work, and just reaching out and just saying, hey, I'm interested in being a credible messenger. How can I get involved? What are the steps? Where are the trainings? That's probably the lowest hanging fruit right there. And then, the more, I would say, intricate thing is reaching out to, maybe some city commissions or city boards or county commissions or county boards, and just starting to show up at different things, and just really connecting with people. I mean, that's like probably the easiest thing that I can think of if someone wants to proactively get involved, and just kind of go from there. I mean, even me as an advocate, that's how I started. I was just showing up at meetings, going to the mayor's office, like reaching out to organizations. Do you have any projects, right? Just to really, you got to kind of dive in the fire. Like I said, there's no roadmap or degree to be a credible messenger or an advocate. This space really takes a lot of courage, and putting yourself out there. So
Yeah, for
not,
sure.
like I said,
Well, I'll put at the end, in the show notes, I'll put some links to organizations that do the Credible Messenger trainings and I think
cool.
a big part of the Credible Messenger process is just becoming part of a community of other OGs that are doing this work, because it is, like you
Yeah.
said, it's really hard, and it is, you have to have some courage. For some people, it's hard to just approach some guy, some kid who's just hanging
Of
out in
course.
the corner,
Yeah.
right? Because they're
Yeah.
not going to talk to you. And they might even tell you to F off, right? They probably will.
Yep.
So,
They
um,
probably will. Yeah.
so it does. It takes training, but it can be so valuable,
Yeah. Yeah.
and make all the difference in a kid's life. The second thing I want to just define is when you talk about advocacy,
Mhm.
as an advocate, what do you feel like you're advocating for?
Um, that's a good question. I think it goes back to that holistic sense, right? Even in a conversation I'm having, I take the sense that I'm advocating for restorative practices, and in any conversation, right? So, for example, in that situation with the community credible messenger in the police department, it's not like I was going to the police department and saying, "Hey, we need to like do a restorative circle around this." I was like, hey, can you just reach out to him and just say, hey, might be a misunderstanding. I know that, but I think it'll make a big deal and difference if you reach out to him, right? And that in itself is restorative in nature, right? It's like breaking up that systems of PD and community. Again, like you said, it just happens so quick that people don't even know what's happening. So it's hard to answer that because it's just like in any conversation I'm having, I feel like I'm moving forward like a restorative practice and an approach.
It sounds like maybe there
Mhm.
was a situation that you needed to let the police department know, look, if you reached out, you could help reduce the tension in this particular situation, right? And
100%. Yeah.
and that's so important, and I think that what you're doing is kind of weaving together, that timeline that we talked about, like, well, maybe if we
Yeah.
went into the school and said, "Look, if the school were to address this issue around bullying, that might help reduce this incident that's coming up," then and then bringing the police in to, it's a we need that kind of cohesion in our society to address violence fully. You can't, like we talked about
Yeah.
earlier, you can't address it at the end when the violence has already happened.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And one thing you said about that, I love that you just brought that up because um, what can get, I think, a little dicey is the narrative. And I even talked to family members about this. They're like, what's happening in the world? I'm like, well, you're actually just seeing all of the chaos that the media is putting out there, or you're reading about it, or maybe you see something or hear something. But it's like in these moments that we're talking about, that actually could have prevented X, Y, and Z violence from happening, right? Or that
Right.
interruption. And I have seen stats go down, but and this goes back to I think the longer term not only solution, but like where are we collecting data and where are we seeing data in a different lens in a different way, right? Versus just, are there zero homicides? Because I think people are missing these little micro pieces that are absolutely 100% reducing and preventing violence, right? But I don't think we look at these little instances too much because again, it goes back to that reactiveness. What are the stats? How many shootings? And that's all obviously critical and obviously important. But I think that for the past year or two, I've been looking at, what are other like research practices that we can put in place that aren't only focusing on like the bigger stats and numbers.
Yeah, that I think that's really important. I think about this, unfortunately, a lot because of school shootings. And we
Yeah.
invariably find that the school shooter had some problems at home. Most of the time, they didn't come from like this, really supportive, perfect family. They tended to be white males, so and exposed to a lot of, information about how you got to be tough and all of that. And then finally, bullying. That often, often,
Mm,
often they said, I was bullied. I was going to get back at all that bullying. Now, of
yeah.
course, just pointing these things out does not make it okay what they did, but those are those opportunities where you could have prevented that person from going off the way they did, perhaps if you address the bullying. It's these combination of factors that we're not putting into context in order to address. And
Yeah,
it's really
exactly.
frustrating
Yeah.
to see. And particularly with with abusive situations at home that we're not making that connection between, being neglected or abused themselves.
Another element that where if we just take a step back and focus on that bridge building and trust and be more methodical and intentional, I think people will see that plays a big impact, right? Like the traumas and I feel like sometimes because in our field we use that saying a lot, right? Like trauma informed, trauma practice, but is it just like a tagline anymore? I'll just be completely bold about that and blunt and upfront. Like, are you just kind of using that because it's just like, oh, like we're trauma informed? But I really think that it takes more methodical practices and intentionality to really see like what does that actually mean case by case. And this is, you'll hear me probably refer to this a bajillion times because it's like this is where I want to head is those longer term solutions where people are sitting down. It's more methodical. It's not just we're not just creating a bunch of taglines, throwing them out there, but what are the actual practices, to your point, that we can actually see a person case by case and really see what the impact is on them on an individual basis versus lumping it all together. Because I also think that's a piece of it too. It's like we lump a lot of things together. We lump the police department together. We lump government together. We lump, gangsters together, but we don't look at like the individual impact of what you're saying people have on their brain. I'm even trying to be more thoughtful. Like, and again, this is just like fresh, that example this week, right? Like I didn't have to go to the police department. Like we could have just said, okay, like we'll just move on. But it is that case by case and like,
Yeah, I agree. I think we have to allow for case by case. Otherwise, we make that mistake of, oh, the kids, there tends to be, a lot of kids that are doing, X, Y, and Z, and they have, this condition. And then you label all kids with that condition. And so we have to
exactly.
start
Yeah.
separating out that everybody's different and that all these components, your amygdala size, whether your hippocampus developed a certain way because you were neglected or you were abused or in childhood, et cetera. There's a neuroscientist who I follow a lot, who's I think maybe a little controversial right now because he's recently wrote a book called Determined. And what he says
Mm.
is that, I don't know if you've heard of him, Robert Sapolsky.
No, I haven't.
He's fascinating, and he says that, he's, kind of studied the brain for many, many years and said that he's kinda come to the conclusion that we don't really have free will. That if you take a person and you kind of dip them into certain situations, the outcome is almost inevitable, or in his case, it's inevitable. And there's an example, and I hope I get the details right on this, but I thought it was really interesting. He has actually been going to court on behalf of some of the defendants in
Okay.
violent cases, and there was a
Yeah.
case where there was a guy who, ended up killing someone, and the guy grew up in a very abusive home. He was neglected, he was abused, he was, on the street when he was quite young, lived as a homeless person. The person that he ended up killing came up to him and attacked him while he was living on the street. And
Mm.
so obviously there was self-defense there. However, he got attacked, and then it took him about 11 seconds before he got up after being attacked and hit the person again and killed the person that had attacked him. So it was basically self-defense, but then it became premeditated because he got up and thought about it and then killed him. And what
Oh, wow.
and
Okay.
again, I hope I'm getting the details right, but what Robert Sapolsky said, or Dr. Sapolsky said at the stand, was that you can't, separate out that time. He had the way that his brain worked, you can't say that was premeditated. It was him reacting in the only way that his brain
Mm.
knew possible. And
That's
wouldn't that
good.
be
Yeah.
interesting if we looked at the world like that and said, we have
Yeah.
built
Huh.
these human beings to do certain things, and in order to help
Hmm.
them not do it, we have to go in and help them fix what went wrong. But yeah, anyway, that may be
Yeah.
an aside. What
No, that's a good example. Yeah. Just a final thought is, and again, it is it. I think I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but it takes so much patience to do that.
Yes.
And in a busy world, and this is what I do have a 5 series advocacy curriculum. I've taught a couple organizations, so it made me think of a piece where I just say, like, think about on a daily basis for just you and I, right? Not even bringing in incredible messengers or trauma or whatever. I'm not saying that we haven't dealt with our own things, but you wake up and then there's just like a flood of social media or a flood of news. And then you go out and then there's your neighbors. And then there's like, the person at the gas station. And it's just like we're constantly filled with all the noise and just moving so quickly that it takes a lot of courage and patience to take a step back and look at these things more methodically. And people just don't want to, I'm not saying everybody, again, I'm not going to lump everybody, but
it's funny because I have the same training where I show, like, the world is constantly pressuring us. And think about how you
Yeah.
react, like, I get up and the news and I have to run to make sure this happens and I have all these responsibilities and then
Yeah.
someone cuts me off and mother,
Yeah.
and you go off and there's
Yeah.
just and if we, we're thinking about this and we're trying to heal the world or whatever we're trying to do. And if we can do
Yeah.
that, now think about somebody who is stuck in that feeling
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
time. They can't calm themselves down. They don't have the tools, the
Yeah.
internal tools. And it's
Yeah.
not an evil thing. It is simply the way that human beings are built. And some people
Yeah.
get built to be super protective of themselves because no one
Yeah.
was there to protect them when they needed it. So yeah,
Exactly.
it's a really important point, and I think
Yeah.
we're missing it. Also I
Yeah.
appreciate that you're saying it's personal to each person, and you can't have
It
a
is.
blanket, like let's just tell everybody to do this or that. We need to be able to personally, and that's what therapy can be good for and all that. But of course, there's not enough therapists. Um, Tell me how did you get into this? You said you grew up in Connecticut and you had this kind of,
Yeah.
uh, easier life, I guess. And so what brought you into this kind of work?
I grew up in Connecticut, town called Glastonbury, Connecticut. And so, yeah, it was a beautiful town to grow up in, predominantly white, not a lot of ethnicity going on there. So that exposed me to be able to speak on behalf of, like I told you, like the everyday person, just going about their day, not really exposed to violence. Like they have this perception of it. So it's nice because I'm able to actually tap into that in some of these conversations with people that don't really understand because I did grow up that way. But that's on my mom's side. So then my dad's side, I got closer with them probably in my mid 20s. They're from Puerto Rico. So my family from Aguas Buenas, Puerto Rico, migrated to a city called Hartford, Connecticut, which is one of the most dangerous towns in the country. And so there was a lot of gang violence and impact. They were impacted by it directly, not so much like the gang violence, but just it was kind of like that subset. So where they grew up in the city, it was around them a lot. So they were exposed to that. And then that side of the family all went on to become like social workers, behavioral health. My uncle's an acupuncturist. So once I grew up and went off to college and started getting closer to that side, I started to tap more into that side of myself. So I was like, all right, cool. Like there's this side that I'm getting to know in my 20s around, what does violence look like? What is it like to immigrate to the States? What is it like to be in that field? And then paired it with my other experience. Like I said, I grew up, I had a communications degree, was going to be in events and marketing and public relations. And so I did that for a little bit. And then I got involved in my own kind of like healing with, what I went through, just, not being exposed to my dad's side of my family. That kind of really impacted me growing up and not being around their culture and piece of my culture, right? It's something that I'm currently still working through, like being part Puerto Rican, but looking white in this field. So I'm working through some new things around that for myself. Just kind of like fleshing all this out for myself and just tapping into, what I really wanted to do authentically. So it showed up as just human rights in total. I was like, all right, I'm going to go make an impact in human rights. And so I was doing a lot of research around like what degrees and programs are out there. There was a peace studies school, so the University of San Diego. So I just looked at it, I toured it, I applied, and I got in for my master's program. And I'll never forget, and I always, and I will drop his name, Armand King. He's one of the staples in San Diego. He was doing a workshop on anti-human trafficking through the Peace Studies School. But he also had experience being a crowd messenger and being impacted by gangs. And so I came into this just kind of like naive, like, oh yeah, like human trafficking, it's just, it's scary and you lock people up and you steal people and all these different elements that I had, again, no idea. And that workshop completely shifted my whole view. That was the first time I learned about credible messengers, learned that, human trafficking and gangs is just in our backyard. And it was honestly that workshop just blew my mind and he blew my mind. And I was like, whatever he's doing, I want to do.
So why didn't
Yeah.
you spend time with your Puerto Rican side of the family?
I think it was just a combination of different things. Like being a kid in that town, it was highly competitive. Like the education system was amazing. I was in sports. I was just trying to fit in, honestly. Like I had all the parts of like a pretty white girl, and so I was like, all right, I'm just gonna fit in, and I'm gonna do this, and this is my MO right now, and I don't really care about anything else. So
Right.
to
Right.
be completely honest, that's my story. Yeah,
That's yeah, but that's I mean, that's what you're supposed to do. I just finished doing a podcast about how we're in a matrix, and the matrix is
yeah,
real. And if you see an advantage in the matrix, who the hell is gonna, why would you not fill that role? Because it does give
yeah,
you power. And now what you've done is you
yeah,
turn that power into greater power, by being able
yeah,
to put yourself into these really important conversations and solutions, building solutions.
yeah.
Um,
I love that you just said that too. I don't think I've encapsulated it quite like that because I do know what it's like to chase power. Like I do know what it's like to want that status and look good and really go after that dream and those shiny things. And so I can see it right there. I can
mm,
see who's doing it or who's not doing it. And it's again, my job as an advocate is not to, you know, I think I started off more as like an angry activist, right? Like I'm just gonna now be on the opposite side and make everyone wrong over there. Right? It's like I can't do that either. So it's like how do I be relatable so that I can make a difference and speak on behalf of because I do know what it's like to
yeah.
chase those things, you know? So
The main thing that I wanted to be able to share with people is really how can they, if they're looking at the issue of violence, and I think it's in our face so much because of particularly school violence, but mass shootings, and then the stories that get told about violence. The violence is happening in some small town by some immigrants that are and not really putting it into context. What what is it about how we look at violence that, from your perspective, if somebody is just listening and says, I'm just like a person that really wants us to stop. I want us to stop killing children in our schools. I want us to feel comfortable, walking around on the street at night. I want to be
yeah,
able to live in this neighborhood and not think that my kid's going to ride their bike and get shot at, which is something that happened just recently. Talked to a mom who that happened, and the kid's okay, but
mm,
those are real experiences for Americans particularly. And
yeah,
what can we do?
yeah. I mean, no easy solution to that, but I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is get involved. I mean, and again, that takes a lot of courage and practice. But too often, I also see like people complaining about things that they just kind of want to be like, all right, well, I can't do anything about it, and so I'm just gonna kind of stay over here. And I'm not saying go like me, like or you, like go start a nonprofit or be a consultant or just get involved in some level, whether that's reaching out to people like us and seeing what's happening, so you can actually say, oh wow, there are things happening, so maybe that that can reduce the fear. I mean, you can't even as much as we would like to, we still can't predict. Like I couldn't predict going outside and there's someone out there with a gun. I mean, it sounds blunt to say, but you just can't, right? So it's
Mhm.
like I said before, like I didn't think I could do anything about it, and then it's like, okay, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, it's like, oh, like I do make an impact. I can make a difference here. Oh, this is actually happening. It's not all the crazy media. Like what? Again, I'm not this is probably a sensitive and controversial conversation, right? It's like there is stuff happening, like you said. There's mass shootings, there's violence. All of that is very real. I don't discount that. That's why I'm in this field. But then there's also the other side of the coin where is that so consuming for people that they're just like, oh my God, the world's going to shit. We can't do anything about it. I can't do anything about it. It really goes down to like such a micro level detail of conversation by conversation, project by project, community by community. What do you want to do to either ease your mind or get involved?
Yeah, I think that's right. I love that. Yeah, I mean, if you're, maybe you don't have time for anything, so you sign up for a newsletter for an organization that deals with violence so that
Exactly.
you're just starting to be aware. If you've got young
Yeah,
children and you volunteer at the school and you see that some kid is being bullied, you help that kid that's being bullied and you make the bullying stop. If you're,
sure.
if
Yep.
you run a company, treat your workers with dignity when you have to let them go, things like that. And people think it's like, well, now I'm responsible for stopping someone from being violent. No, you're just part of creating an environment where violence
Exactly.
becomes less of an option. And, and for the love of God, can we get guns out of people's hands? I mean, especially ARs.
Yeah.
I don't care. I'm going to say it because it needs to be said. It's not right. And so
Yeah.
everything that we can do as human beings, as parts of our community that helps to reduce the need for violence and feeling violence. If someone cuts you off, don't, speed up and go up against them. Just be like, okay, maybe they didn't know. Maybe they're having a bad day. Like, just let it
Exactly.
go. And
Yeah.
you'll feel
Yeah.
better too. So all right, Amanda, is there
Exactly.
anything else that you feel like you
Yeah.
wanted to say? Oh, and I have one more question for you. But
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh.
is there anything that you wanted to say that you felt like we didn't cover that you want to, or do you feel like we hit the points?
I think we hit the points. I think I'll wrap up just by saying, even a lot of the things that I do in my advocacy training, and I think it encapsulates this entire conversation, is I think that there can be really simple solutions, but the most simplistic solutions sometimes are the hardest and take the most effort, like as a human, right? Patience and courage, and those things are, I think, way more difficult than just like running around. And so I'd like to leave people with that. It's like, if you have a simple idea, it's probably brilliant, and it's just probably really difficult for people to wrap their head around, right? Because you look at the critical justice movement, it's pretty simple. People that have been prone to crime, they restore their life, and now they're mentors or they're going out in gangs. For some reason, we've like complicated that whole thing. So the most simple ideas, I think, are the most brilliant, but sometimes really difficult to
Well,
implement.
true, but I want to point out something really interesting about the things that we can do are the things that we can do. In other words, we're not responsible for going and changing the entire system. If you can change yourself
Right.
and be more patient, be more thoughtful about how you deal with situations that feel aggressive, or having the courage to go out and speak to somebody, these are things that you have control over, and then see what happens. You can't change the whole system, and I think that's one of the things that can get very
Mm,
frustrating is you see terrible thing that happened because of violence, and you just throw up your hands and say, what can we do? And there's actually there's things you can do internally, and that
yeah.
gives you some control and power. All right, my last question that I always ask everybody, and I forgot to tell you this, but surprise, is my
That's
last
okay.
my last question I always ask everybody is, who made a difference for you when you were growing up?
Uh, I mean, my entire family, but I do think of my grandfather who passed away last May. Was he's the one that started the family in Puerto Rico, and he went there. He was in the army, and this white Irish man just going to Puerto Rico and fell in love with my grandmother because he was teaching English there, right? Like, this guy is just, he traveled around the world. He really emanated everything that I appreciate now with who I am, right? Just gave me a book about Buddhism. I was like, what is this? And like years later, I read it. And so, for me, he encapsulates like that, like I said, that white power that we were talking about, but then also that soft cultural side, and how do you kind of mix all of that together? So he was not only like a second dad to me, but just taught me a lot more about these things that it just took me years and years and years to catch up with all the things that he used to say growing up. So that was my grandfather. Yeah.
And when you
Yeah.
say white power, you don't mean white power. You mean like he understood that he had this privilege as a white person.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for watching or listening wherever you are. And please subscribe, please follow us. And I want to tell you about some upcoming podcasts. So we have one on weed. What does it do to your brain? Good and bad. We have another one on what are kids doing after school? Again, good and bad. And finally, a really important one about the 988 number, suicide hotline number, and what you can do if you notice signs, and what are the signs that someone, or if you yourself are having those kinds of thoughts. It's going to be a really good conversation. So I hope you'll follow us, and thanks again for being here.